indeed for inviting me to speak. Right, okay. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to address you. Why should we listen to John Henry Newman, someone from another age, the 19th century, in this, the third decade of the 21st century? What has he got to say to today's students, especially those at McGill, who either live at the Newman Centre or who frequent it? The quick answer to the first question is that we should pay attention, great attention, to what Newman says, because his thinking is so rich and thought-provoking, because of much of it can be adapted to the times in which we live now. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has spoken of Newman as, I quote, someone of high intellectual powers, someone well aware of the claims of the Enlightenment, someone with a distinctively modern sensibility and literary style, who at a time when Catholicism seemed to be intellectually impoverished and unable to come to terms with the claims made in the name of secular reason, had identified himself with the Catholic faith. Pope Benedict XVI, during his state visit to Britain in September 2010, which culminated in Newman's beatification, spoke of the modernity of Newman's existence, his great culture, and his constant quest for truth as three elements which give Newman an exceptional greatness for our time and make him, I quote, a figure of doctor of the church for us. Newman lived at the beginning of post-Enlightenment times, our times, when new ideas were beginning to work their way into society and the university. And it's remarkable how observant he was about contemporary trends, and how accurate in his diagnosis of educational practices which distorted the true nature of education. The historian Christopher Dawson comments that Newman was the first Christian thinker in the English-speaking world who fully realized the nature of modern secularism, an enormous change that was already in the process of development, although a century had still to pass before it was to produce its full harvest of destruction. Newman is therefore someone who speaks to the modern world. His insights into the human condition and his interest in the world around him lend his words an example, the quality of a great Christian humanist. His educational classic, The Idea of University, is widely recognized as the most influential book written on the nature and purpose of university education. It is still quoted today, and not just in annual Newman lectures. It's also, yes, widely quoted in literature debating the state of the academy today. Newman is often, in fact, taken as the starting point in some discussions. Sometimes he's even taken as the central figure, as in What Are Universities For?, published in 2012 by Stephen Collini, who's Professor of Intellectual History and English Literature at the University of Cambridge in England, a leading man of the left, I should add. The Idea of University is one of the great works of non-fiction in English, but it's not an easy read for three reasons. Its subject matter, philosophy of education, Newman's style of argumentation, statements, qualifying statements, which are then in turn themselves qualified and counterbalanced. And thirdly, his scintillating, almost hypnotizing prose, which at times distracts the reader from the underlying arguments. Despite the idea being Newman's main claim to fame in education, I'm not intending to dwell on or indeed quote much from it for two reasons. Firstly, Newman declares that the idea is about the essence of a university, the strict idea, that is, or the core activity, namely students being taught by lecturers. The first half of the idea comprises the lectures which Newman composed and partly delivered in 1852 as a prelude to founding a Catholic university in Dublin at the invitation of the Irish bishops. In these lectures, Newman was not primarily concerned with the integrity of the university, namely its fully flourishing state, all those things added to the core activity that fill it out, that enable it to function with ease and flourish as an institution, and thereby allow the individuals in it to flourish too. For that, we need to look elsewhere, to 20 university sketches about the image of the university as it developed over 2 millennia. This is currently in Historical Sketches, Volume 3, the first and major part, 200 or 300 pages long, these 20 sketches. And we also need to look at Newman's, the University Newman established and ran for 4 years in Dublin. So it's worth stressing that Newman was deeply immersed in the practice of education all his life. He's not merely a theoretician. Now, when Newman set up the Catholic University in Ireland, he did so almost single-handedly. Virtually every aspect of it came into being because of him. This is a truly extraordinary achievement in its own right. But Newman was not content to remain in administrative isolation. Not only did he oversee every aspect of the life of the nation's university as its rector, or I think as you would say, as its vice-chancellor and principal, designing the structure based partly on his experience of 30 years at Oxford, as well as his considerable knowledge of the university landscape across Europe, but he actually ran one of the residential collegiate houses that were emblematic of his pastoral approach to education. He turned his rector's lodgings into a collegiate house called St. Mary's and took in around a dozen students, as well as 2 of the lecturers to tutor the students. In other words, not that different from Newman House at McGill. Besides acting as dean of this house, Newman undertook the role of chaplain as well as that of a third tutor. Newman's rich idea of residential life fills out the strict idea of a university and helps to create the ideal conditions for genuine human flourishing. So what was this idea and what might it look like today? Well, it's worth setting the scene by highlighting a few key principles of Newman's vision. As I suggest in the title, Education in a Broad Sense, Newman had a wide understanding of the word education. In the idea, he famously declared that, I quote, if I had to choose between a so-called university which dispensed with residents and tutorial superintendents and gave its degrees to any person who passed an examination in a wide range of subjects, and a university which had no professors or examinations at all, but merely brought a number of young men together for 3 or 4 years, then he would have no hesitation in opting for that university which did nothing over that which exacted of its members an acquaintance with every science under the sun. Now, he explains he was not saying which was morally the better, but rather which was the better discipline of the intellect, which was the more successful in training, moulding, and enlarging the mind, which sent out men the more fitted for their secular duties, which produced better public men, men of the world, men whose names would descend to posterity. And of course, for men, please read men and women. This is a provocative and highly challenging opinion, especially given Newman's fame for occupying the academic high ground. Newman made the same point more succinctly in a private letter where he stated that, broadly speaking, residence without examinations comes nearer to the idea of university education than examinations without residence. He went on to say that university education is, properly speaking, no equivalent. What is most like an equivalent in its effect is for a youth to be well-read, well-travelled, and well-introduced, though this was not the result of a system. If Newman were around today, he would undoubtedly describe online education as fake education, or at least a very poor substitute for the real thing. These remarks make it clear that Newman had a broad conception of what he meant by education, and that he resisted the tendency, common then as now, to reduce its meaning and narrow its scope. Newman was interested in giving a deep human and Christian formation at one and the same time. Then, as now, there was a common mistake of viewing education as the imparting of knowledge, rather than the training of the mind, character formation, and the acquisition of habits. The danger of this tendency is that it diminishes what education is about and neglects important dimensions about it. Education is not confined to the formal setting of lecture hall or laboratory, to seminar or class. It also takes place in neat semi-formal setting of organized student activities such as music making, obviously choirs and orchestras, the stage, debating, student journalism, and of course sport. Education for Newman also takes place in completely informal settings, such as meal times and other social events. So whenever students gather, he says in the idea, and I quote, "They are sure to learn from one another, even if there be no one to teach them. The conversation of all is a series of lectures to each, and they gain for themselves new ideas and views, fresh matters of thought, and distinct principles for judging and acting day by day." It could even be said that students learn more from each other than from their lecturers, more outside the lecture hall than from within, though obviously what is learned is probably of a different nature. As an undergraduate at Trinity College, Oxford, Newman studied 2 degrees, the only 2 available at the time: classics, that is Latin and Greek, philosophy and history and literature, and also mathematics, which included a good deal of physics. Without stinting on his studies, Newman took up the works of the historian Edward Gibbon and the philosopher John Locke. He entered himself for university prizes, attended concerts, studied manuals and tried experiments in chemistry, attended lectures in the newly emerging discipline of geology. He played first violin at a music club at St. John's College. He co-founded the Trinity College Book Society, in which they read modern novels such as Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. And with his closest friend, John Bowden, he composed and printed for public circulation a verse romance. And together they started the second truly undergraduate magazine in Oxford called The Undergraduate. In Dublin, where Newman was rector, he ensured that sporting interests were met by the purchase of a cricket field. And, can you believe it, the setting up of a billiards room, complete with its own marker. That might seem strange, of course, Newman and billiard rooms, but there was a problem there in Dublin. The university decided to ban attendance at the Great Billiards House in Dublin. The problem there was the students would be exposed to gambling, which was a great problem at the time. Newman's pet project at the Catholic University in Dublin was the establishment of the Literary and Historical Society, what then quickly became called and is called now the LNH. This continues to this day at University College Dublin, which is the successor to Newman's University. Now, the LNH wasn't just a debating society, as you might imagine, or public speaking society. It was an outlet for student journalism and literary compositions. And in fact, virtually every member of the university belonged to it. We know from its elaborate rule book that all its members were required in turn to chair meetings. Now, saying all this may give the impression that Newman discounted the academic life of the academy and simply viewed university as a sort of finishing school. And that's certainly not the case. The thing is, I'm focusing on that side because it's often dwelt on so little. The academic dimension is developed willingly and at great lengths in the idea of university, and you're highly encouraged to read it. But as I say, it's a very difficult book. I'm on the second cycle of a 2-year reading of it with graduate students at Oxford. It isn't just the idea we're reading, it's all his major educational writings, but it is jolly difficult, it's got to be said. Now, allow me to mention and develop just one theme that runs through the idea. And in particular, his 5th lecture, although that one is actually missing from the idea. This concerns Newman's stress on the importance of what we nowadays call joined up thinking, of gaining what Newman calls a connected view. At the university, the student specializes. That's all well and good, and Newman would fully approve of that. But at the same time, Newman stresses that we should gain an overview of everything, as ultimately all knowledge is connected. since it derives from a single creator. Newman is keen that we know a little bit about all the major subject areas so that we appreciate that each has its own methods, its own starting points, forms of argumentation, and ways of reaching truth. This approach helps us to keep from extravagance. It enables us to relate disciplines to one another, to see how the pieces of the jigsaw of creation fit together, and importantly, not to be dismissive of other ways of reaching truth. Otherwise, we become like the student of economics, who fraternizes only with other economists, whose only reading is The Economist, and effectively, that person, it becomes somebody who has economics for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Now, note that this connected view is we learn not from lecturers in the main, but from mixing with other students from other disciplines, and taking interest in what they're about. Turning from intellectual virtues, that's just one thing I'm mentioning from the idea, to human and other virtues, what does Newman have to say about the modern secular university? His establishment of a Catholic university in the 1850s appears at first glance to suggest it hasn't much to offer us. Not so, I would argue. And to do so, we have to bear in mind that the direct end of the university, as Newman asserts, is knowledge or cultivation of mind, just as the direct end of a hospital is bodily health. Neither is directly intended to make men religious. A university, and he means a Catholic university, is not ipso facto a church institution. Like a hospital, it has no direct call to make men or women Catholic or religious, for that is the previous and contemporaneous office of the church. Nevertheless, the indirect effects of a Catholic university are religious. As the church uses hospitals religiously, so she uses universities. In order to secure its religious character and for the morals of its members, Newman argues, she has ever adopted, together with it and within its precincts, seminaries, halls, colleges, and monastic establishments, or as we might say, Catholic chaplaincies and Newman Centres. For Newman, the essence of a university consists in the communication of knowledge and lectures and students in the professorial system. But the influence of professors alone is insufficient, he argues, for its well-being, for a rich and full life, and all that the term eudaimonia, human flourishing, connotes. For its sure and comfortable existence, Newman says, we must look to law, rule, order, to religion, from which law proceeds, to the collegiate system in which it is embodied. In the 20 university sketches I referred to earlier, Newman argues in two of them that the university and college serve complementary purposes, as do lecturer and tutor. And combining these two complementarities, university and college, tutor and lecturer, Newman arrives at his conclusion. The professorial system fulfills the strict idea of a university and is sufficient for its being, but it is not sufficient for its well-being. Colleges constitute the integrity of a university. He goes on to assert that the colleges are the direct and special instruments which the church uses in a university for the attainment of her sacred objects. So while the core activity of university may labour under severe handicaps, where whole subject areas may be dismissed or distorted, the college and its many equivalents are still able to exert a wholesome influence. In the course of reflecting on his Irish campaign and reading over his Dublin correspondence 20 years after his return to England, Newman concluded that he had known more about the Irish situation than the Pope at the time, that he had placed too much human trust in the Pope's sagacity in human affairs, in his worldly wisdom. And he wondered if it had not been better if Pope Pius IX had not pressed the Irish bishops to establish university, a Catholic university, and instead urged them to adapt to the situation and to come to terms with the non-denominational Queen's Colleges, which the British government had established in Ireland in 1845. Now, a parallel situation arose in Oxford in the 1860s over whether to establish a Catholic hall there, or else just a chaplaincy. There were certainly advantages to each, and the two approaches were discussed at length in the Catholic press until the bishops intervened. Catholics from England and Wales were effectively banned by the hierarchy from entering Oxford and Cambridge until 1895, just after Newman died. The laity were warned by the bishop that they would be putting their sons into proximate danger of grave sin if they allowed them to attend. Newman declined to participate in the public debate about Catholic higher education, as he felt constrained by having written so strongly in favour of establishing Catholic universities. Nevertheless, in private, Newman did express his views about attending a secular or non-denominational university. In 1872, he spoke frankly to a leading layman, Lord Howard of Glossop. This letter has special applicability for those who attend universities which are all but secular in name, and so is worth quoting at length. Newman says, right, we are driven into a corner just now and have to act when no mode of action is even bearable. It is a choice of great difficulties. On the whole, I do not know how to avoid the conclusion that mixed education, by which he means religiously plural, in the higher schools is as much a necessity now in England as it was in the days of St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom. The more I think of it, the less I am satisfied with the proposal of establishing a Catholic college in our universities, and I suppose the idea of a Catholic university pure and simple is altogether out of the question. Newman thought that the bishops should repeal their virtual prohibition of young Catholics attending Oxford, and that they should counter what can only be tolerated as the least of evils by placing a strong presence in Oxford. This should be a strong religious community which would act as a support and rallying point for young Catholics in their dangerous position, commanding their respect intellectually and winning their confidence, and providing quiet opportunities for their being kept straight, both in faith and conduct. I continue to quote, the true and only antagonist of the world, the flesh and the devil, is the direct power of religion as acting in the confessional, in confraternities, in social circles, in personal influence, in private intimacies, and so on. All this would be secured by a strong mission to work zealously and prudently, and in no other way. To get a better idea what Newman meant, we need to examine more closely this conception of a college or collegiate house. Newman defines the term college to mean a body of men not merely living together in one dwelling, but belonging to a single establishment. It is a household which involves the same virtuous and paternal discipline which is proper to a family and a home. Being a domestic establishment in which teachers and taught live together as one family, the college is, I quote, all and does all which is implied in the name of home. Young men leave the family home to find another, a home from home. Ideally, the collegiate home assumes the characteristics of a family home, and thus becomes the shrine of our best affections, the bosom of our fondest recollections, a spell upon our afterlife, a stay for the world-weary mind and soul. There's no contradiction between these homely images and the disciplinary role that Newman gives to the college, because by discipline, he means not an externally imposed code of conduct or behaviour, but the discipline of a regular and ordered personal and social life, a self-discipline that is intellectual, moral, and religious. In this way, the college would take over where family leaves off by providing a place of refuge and companionship, and also prayer and instruction. In Dublin, all the collegiate houses, and there were 5 when Newman left in 1858, all the houses that were established as part of the university had their own private chapels where Mass was celebrated before breakfast and where prayers were said at night. The University Church, on the other hand, was a separate building and had its own role to play. Switching slightly here, in all Newman did to prepare lay Christians for the world of work, family, and society, Newman is a champion of the formation of the laity. His aim was to help form young people to take a full part in the world, to defend their beliefs, and to be able to spread them. I quote a sentence I love very much: "Today a pupil, tomorrow a member of the great world, today confined to the lives of the saints, tomorrow thrown upon Babel." Newman helped form the next generation of lay faithful by giving them an education, it is a lovely expression, to fit men for this world while it trained them for the next. Newman wanted the laity to wake up and become an active force, both within the church and the world. For this, they needed to be trained and educated. Now, what are Newman's views on the religious education at university? These are apparent from a public letter he wrote in the third year of the university to the professors at the Catholic University. And in it, he stresses that the university should teach Christian knowledge in what may be called its secular aspect, as it is practically useful in the intercourse of life and in general conversation. University authorities needed to realize that their students were going out into a world not of professed Catholics, but of inveterate, often bitter, commonly contemptuous Protestants, or perhaps, as we might say nowadays, of militant atheists, who were well versed in their own doctrines and arguments. Newman hoped that the university would be able to help its students grasp what the difference was between a church and a sect, between ecclesiastical and civil authority, what the church claims for itself of necessity and what it can dispense with, what it can grant and what it cannot. Students needed to know how to answer questions commonly asked of Catholics, and these coming up are the examples Newman gives. Whether the celibacy of the clergy was a matter of faith or church discipline, whether the Pope, by appointing a hierarchy, and is referring to the year 1850, when the hierarchy was restored in England and Wales, to whether the Pope, by appointing such a hierarchy, was interfering with the prerogatives of the monarch, whether and in what sense Catholics consider Protestants to be heretics. Questions such as these, which occur naturally in conversations, often did not require, Newman says, sophisticated arguments, but just a few pertinent words stating the facts. I quote, "Half the controversies which go on in the world arise from the ignorance of the facts of the case. Half the prejudices against Catholicity lie in the misinformation of the prejudiced parties. Candid persons are set right and enemies silence by the mere statement of what it is we believe." What is not satisfactory, Newman says, is for a Catholic to say, "I'll ask a priest," or as we might say, "I'll look it up on the internet." Instead, he says a Catholic ought to gratify even the curiosity of people who speak against the Catholic Church by giving them information, because it was generally the case, he says, that such information will also be an argument. Newman liked to illustrate this point by telling the story of three Tractarian friends of his from Oriel, all Anglican clergymen who were touring Ireland in the early 1830s. On one occasion, excuse me, found themselves with a boy aged 13 who was acting as their guide. Amusing themselves by putting religious questions to the young Catholic, they soon found themselves silenced by his replies, not, of course, by his theological arguments, but merely by his knowing and understanding the answers in his catechism. If you were to read this long letter about religious education at the Catholic University, you would see that it is truly formidable in its aspiration. But note, Newman argues that the office of a Catholic university is to teach faith and the colleges to protect morals. Once again, we see that Newman attributes different roles to the university and the college or its equivalent. He envisaged in Dublin that the students would attend public lectures in lecture halls or the university church on Christian doctrine, while at the colleges or their equivalent, they would learn their faith and piety would be nourished. In an extraordinary prescient passage in one of his university sketches, Newman identifies the chief dangers of any professorial system which neglects the collegiate dimension, the pastoral dimension of a university education, effectively the system which predominates in the West today. He asserts, these may be called the three vital principles of the Christian student: faith, chastity, love, because their contraries, unbelief or heresy, impurity, and enmity, are just the three great sins against God, ourselves, and our neighbour, which are the death of the soul. It's easy to see the results in today's students: religious infidelity and indifferentism, sexual license of every kind, and an unpleasantly narcissistic individualism. All that I've said so far might seem more applicable to those who live at the Newman Centre than those who don't. So what does Newman have to say for those who live elsewhere? Are there takeaways for you as well? Well, when setting up the Catholic University in Dublin, Newman had hoped to make it a fully residential university, but he soon found this was simply impossible. Dublin was not Oxford. At nearby Protestant Trinity College, Dublin, founded in the late 16th century, only 20% of the students lived in college, the rest with relatives and friends in Dublin or elsewhere. Newman wrestled with how to overcome this obstacle as he set such a high premium on residential living. The solution he adopted was to create a category of students called quasi-interns. A category of students which he wanted to become the predominant type. These students would attach themselves to one of the collegiate houses at his university. The students were thereby to be present during the working hours of the day, which for him meant from mass before breakfast in the morning until the early evening. They were to dine in their collegiate house, to take part in the house socials, to join the house sports teams, to be tutored at their house. In this way, non-resident students, but attached to the collegiate houses, would gain most of the benefits of student living. I'm not going to translate it into modern terms, and certainly don't wish to imply that Catholic students should do all they can to shun the university and take refuge in a Catholic bunker. Far from it. There's obviously a balance to be sought. I thought I would finish by pointing out to a shortcoming that might affect chaplaincies or Newman Centres at modern secular universities. Even at the Catholic University in Dublin, Newman was aware that there were two centres of influence. In his first sermon at the University Church, he addressed what he foresaw as a dangerous dichotomy. I'm going to quote from two paragraphs here, right at the end of this sermon. I wish the intellect to range with the utmost freedom, and religion to enjoy an equal freedom. But what I am stipulating for is that they should be found in one and the same place and exemplified in the same persons. I want to destroy that diversity of centres that puts everything into confusion by creating a contrariety of influences. I wish the same spots and the same individuals to be at once oracles of philosophy and shrines of devotion. It will not satisfy me what satisfies so many, to have two independent systems, intellectual and religious, going at once, side by the sort of division of labour, and only accidentally brought together. It will not satisfy me if religion is here and science there, and young men converse with science all day and lodge with religion in the evening. It is not touching the evil, if young men eat and sleep and drink in one place and think in another. I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and moral discipline. Devotion is not a sort of finish given to the sciences, nor is science a feather in the cap to devotion. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and a devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. This is no matter of terms nor subtle distinctions. Sanctity has its influence, intellect has its influence. The influence of sanctity is the greater on the long run. The influence of intellect is greater at the moment. Therefore, in the case of the young whose education lasts a few years, where the intellect is, there is the influence. Their literary, their scientific teachers really have the forming of them. Let both influences act freely, and then, as a general rule, no system of mere religious guardianship which neglects the reason will, in matter of fact, succeed against the school. Young people need a masculine religion if it is to carry captive their restless imaginations and their wild intellects, as well as to touch their susceptible hearts. I shall finish there with Newman's words.